The subdivision of Oak Creek prided itself on uniformity. Grass cut to exactly 2 inches, beige stucco facades, and silence. But silence isn't peace. Sometimes it's just the quiet before a demolition. When the Homeowners Association Board decided my property line was merely a suggestion for their new vanity project, they thought they were crushing a stubborn old man who refused to update his fence. They didn't know I spent 40 years as a county surveyor, and I didn't just have a deed. I had the original geodetic markers. This is the story of how a corrupt board tried to bury the truth in paperwork, only to find themselves standing on land they didn't actually own. Stick around as we peel back the layers of this legal nightmare. The morning sun over Oak Creek didn't just rise, it was permitted to enter. The neighborhood was a masterclass in controlled aesthetics, a place where nature was tolerated only as long as it adhered to the bylaws. Section 4, Paragraph C. Elias Thorne sat on his back porch, a mug of black coffee steaming in the cool October air. He wasn't looking at the manicured lawns of his neighbors. He was looking at the jagged, ancient oak tree that marked the southeast corner of his lot. It was a chaotic, beautiful thing, its roots gnarled and raised, defying the flatness of the surrounding suburbia. Elias was a man who understood lines. For 40 years, he had trekked through swamps, forests, and construction sites with a transit level on his shoulder, defining where one thing ended and another began. Civil engineering wasn't just math to him. It was the geometry of the truth. A line on a map was a contract. A sharp metallic clack from the front of the house broke his solitude. It wasn't the mail carrier. The mail carrier, a pleasant woman named Sarah, drove a truck with a distinct whine in the transmission, and she wasn't due for another 3 hours. This was the sound of the brass mail slot snapping shut with unnecessary force. Elias took a slow sip of coffee, set the mug down on the weathered teak table, and stood up. He walked through his house, a structure that, unlike the stucco McMansions surrounding it, felt lived in. Books on topography and geology lined the hallway. When he opened the front door, the cul-de-sac was quiet. A silver Lexus SUV was just rounding the corner, its taillights flaring red as it braked at the stop sign before vanishing. On the floor beneath the mail slot lay a creamy, heavy stock envelope. The return hour and address was embossed in gold foil, the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. Elias didn't rip it open. He walked to his study, retrieved a stainless steel letter opener, and slit the top edge cleanly. He unfolded the single sheet of paper. Notice of violation. Third notice, unauthorized structure, encroachment. Dear Mr. Thorne, it has come to the board's attention that you have failed to rectify the violation regarding the wooden perimeter fence located on the southeast quadrant of your lot. As discussed in previous correspondence, dated September 12th and September 28th, this structure encroaches upon Common Area B and obstructs the proposed Creek View walking path. Furthermore, the fence is in a state of disrepair that violates the community aesthetic standards. You have 14 days to remove the structure at your own expense. Failure to do so will result in the HOA contracting a removal service, the cost of which will be billed to your account, along with a daily fine of $150 until the issue is resolved. Sincerely, Linda Calloway. President Elias lowered the paper. His expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Third notice, he whispered to the empty room. He had never received a first or a second notice. He walked over to the large bay window that looked out over the side yard. The fence in question was a split-rail cedar design. It had been there when he bought the land 20 years ago, 5 years before the Oak Creek subdivision was even built around him. He had refused to sell the back acre to the developers then, and he certainly wasn't going to give it to them now. He moved to his filing cabinet, a heavy fireproof vertical unit. He pulled the second drawer, labeled Property and Tax, and thumbed past the insurance documents until his fingers brushed against a thick, yellowed envelope. The deed. And more importantly, the survey plat from 1975, signed by the county assessor long before Linda Calloway had ever set foot in this zip code. He pulled the map out and spread it on his desk. He grabbed his loupe, a small magnifying glass used by jewelers and surveyors, and leaned in. He traced the line of the creek. He traced the coordinates of the iron pin he knew was buried 3 feet deep under the mud near the oak tree. Common Area B, Elias mused, his voice dry. He looked out the window again. A drone was hovering near his property line. It was white, sleek, and staring right at his fence. They weren't just asking, they were scouting. Elias picked up his phone. He didn't call the HOA. He didn't call a lawyer. He called the county records office. Marge, it's Elias. I need to schedule a pull on the microfiche. No, the old archives, the ones they didn't digitize yet. He hung up and looked back at the drone. You want to talk about boundaries, Linda? He said softly. Let's talk about boundaries. The Oak Creek Community Center smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. It was a space designed to mimic a town hall, with vaulted ceilings and recessed lighting that cast a spotlight on the raised dais where the 5 board members sat. Elias walked in 4 minutes early. He wore a pressed button-down shirt and held a manila folder containing the single letter he had received. He didn't sit in the back. He sat in the second row, directly in front of the placard that read President, Linda Calloway. Linda was younger than he expected, perhaps in her late 40s, with hair that didn't move when she turned her head and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was tapping away on a tablet, ignoring the 30 or so residents filing in behind her. The meeting began with the usual banality: budget approvals for flower bed mulch, complaints about trash can visibility, and a debate over the permissible shade of beige for exterior trim. Elias waited, his patience honed by decades of waiting for rain to clear so he could shoot a grade. New business, Linda announced, her voice amplified by the microphone. The Creek View walking path. As you know, this project will increase our property values by an estimated 8%. We are moving into the final acquisition phase. Elias stood up. He didn't shout. He simply projected his voice, a skill learned on windy construction sites. Madam President, Elias said. The room went silent. Linda looked over her reading glasses, her expression shifting from bored to annoyed. Mr. Thorne, she said, recognizing him immediately, this is the board presentation section. Resident comments are reserved for the open forum at the end of the session. I am speaking to the acquisition phase you just mentioned, Elias continued, remaining standing. I received a third notice of violation today regarding my property line. I never received a first or second. I am here to correct the record before you spend community funds on land you don't have access to. You are out of order, Linda said, her voice dropping an octave. The violation regarding your encroachment is a separate legal matter handled by the Compliance Committee, not the General Assembly. The Compliance Committee is you, Linda, Elias countered, holding up the letter, and the encroachment is a fence that has stood since before this building was poured concrete. You are claiming common area rights on a private deed. Sit down, Mr. Thorne, a male board member to Linda's right barked. This was Greg, the treasurer, a man who looked like he'd never held a shovel in his life. I have a right to be heard, Elias said, stepping into the aisle. If you are planning to bulldoze private property based on a survey you haven't shared with the homeowner, that isn't HOA business. That is theft. Linda slammed the gavel down. The sound cracked through the room like a pistol shot. Mr. Thorne, you are in violation of the Code of Conduct, Section 8, Disruption of Board Proceedings. Consider this a formal verbal warning. If you continue, you will be removed. I'm not disrupting, Elias said, his voice hard. I'm testifying. Officer? Linda looked toward the back of the room. An off-duty police officer hired as private security for the meeting stepped forward from the shadows. He looked apologetic but firm. Sir, you need to sit down or leave. Elias looked around the room. The other neighbors were looking at him with a mix of pity and irritation. They didn't care about the truth. They just wanted the meeting to end so they could go home. They didn't see a man fighting for his rights. They saw a disruption to the schedule. Elias nodded slowly. He didn't look at the officer. He looked directly at Linda. I'll leave, Elias said, but you're mistaking silence for consent, Linda. That's a dangerous error in calculation. He turned and walked out, the heavy double doors swinging shut behind him. When he got back to his house, his phone buzzed with an email notification. It was an automated alert from the Oak Creek resident portal. New charge added. Elias logged in. Violation, disruptive behavior at assembly. $250. Violation, failure to remedialize fence. Day 1. 150. Violation, failure to remedialize fence. Day 2. 150 won. Legal admin fee, 500 won. The total balance flashed in red, $1,150. They weren't waiting for the 14 days to expire. They were accelerating. They wanted to bury him in debt before he could even file a motion. Elias closed the laptop. He walked to the hallway closet and pulled down a heavy dust-covered box from the top shelf. Inside lay his old field gear, a plumb bob, 100-foot steel tape, and a set of prism poles. He wasn't going to argue with them in their meeting room again. He was going to argue on the ground. The sound was distinct and rhythmic. Thwack, thwack, thwack. It was the sound of a heavy mallet driving seasoned wood into soft earth. Elias was in his kitchen, pouring his second cup of coffee, when the noise cut through the double-pane glass. He set the pot down, the liquid sloshing slightly over the rim. He knew that sound. It was the sound of possession. He walked to the back door, sliding the screen open. The morning air was crisp, but the scent of pine was overpowered by the chemical smell of fresh aerosol paint. 3 men in neon yellow safety vests were moving along the bank of the creek. One held a GPS rover pole, another carried a bundle of wooden lath stakes, and the third was wielding a can of fluorescent orange spray paint. They were methodically drawing a line across the grass, a line that cut 20 feet inside Elias's property boundary. Elias didn't run. He walked. He moved with the heavy, deliberate gait of a man who knew exactly where he was placing his feet. He grabbed his phone from his pocket and hit record, holding it low but steady. "Morning, boss," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The man with the spray can stopped, the nozzle dripping orange onto the dew-covered grass. He looked up, shielding his eyes against the sun. He was young, maybe 30, with the logo of Greenscale Landscaping on his vest. "Morning," the worker replied, sounding guarded. "You're drifting," Elias said, pointing to the stake the man had just driven into the ground. "That pin you're marking is for the drainage easement, not the property line. The property line is 15 feet back toward the water." The worker wiped his forehead. "I'm just following the layout, sir. Digital site plan says the cut line is here." "The digital site plan is wrong," Elias said, "and you're trespassing. I need you to pull those stakes and step back to the creek bed." The worker looked past Elias toward the street. "Look, buddy, I don't want any trouble. I just have a work order." "And I have a deed," Elias said. He took a step forward, not aggressively, but assertively, occupying the space. "Pack it up. He doesn't have the authority to tell you to stop." The voice came from the side yard. Elias turned. Linda Calloway was walking across his lawn, her heels sinking slightly into the soft turf. She wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a uniformed sheriff's deputy, his thumbs hooked casually into his duty belt. Elias felt a cold spike of adrenaline, but he kept his face impassive. He turned the camera slightly to include them in the frame. "Linda," Elias acknowledged, "you brought an escort for a landscaping quote?" "It's not a quote, Mr. Thorne. It's commencement of work," Linda said, stopping 5 feet away. She held a clipboard against her chest like a shield. "We anticipated you might be difficult. Officer Miller is here to ensure the safety of our contractors." Officer Miller stepped forward. He looked tired. "Mr. Thorne, I'm Deputy Miller. Ms. Calloway tells me you've been obstructing authorized maintenance on HOA common grounds." "This isn't common ground," Elias said, keeping his eyes on the deputy. "This is private property. Fee simple. I pay taxes on every square foot of grass these men are painting orange." "The HOA plat says otherwise," Miller said. He gestured to the tablet Linda was now holding up. It showed a satellite overlay with a bright blue line cutting through Elias's yard. "According to this, the common area extends 30 feet from the water's center. You're standing in it." "That overlay is based on a GIS approximation," Elias explained, his voice tightening. "It has a margin of error of 10 feet. You cannot use it for construction. You need to find the physical iron pins." "We don't need to dig up the yard, Mr. Thorne," Linda interrupted, her voice dripping with condescension. "The board has approved the survey. These men are working. If you interfere with them, you are interfering with a legal entity's right to maintain its property." Elias looked at the deputy. "Officer, if they cut this fence, they are destroying private property. I want to file a trespassing complaint." Miller sighed. "Sir, this is a civil dispute. I can't adjudicate property lines in a backyard But I can enforce the peace. If the HOA has a permit and a work order, I can't stop them. But if you physically impede them, I can arrest you for disorderly conduct. Elias looked at the orange line. It severed his garden in half. It cut through the root system of the oak tree. It was a lie painted on the ground, enforced by a badge and a clipboard. He realized then that he couldn't win this here. Not today. If he stood his ground physically, he would end up in the back of a squad car, and the fence would be gone by the time he made it. Bail. The law was on his side, but the enforcement was looking at the wrong map. He needed the source. Elias slowly lowered his phone. Fine. Linda smiled, a tight, victorious expression. Wise choice, Elias. Please remove your personal items from the construction zone by tomorrow morning. The excavators arrive at 8:00 a.m. Tomorrow, Elias repeated. He turned his back on them. He didn't look at the workers. He walked back toward his house, feeling the eyes of the deputy on his back. He went straight to his study. He didn't sit down. He grabbed his keys and the large, empty architectural tube he used for transporting blueprints. The digital maps were the weapon. They were using the county's digitized records, which were often just scans of scans, rubber-sheeted over satellite photos. Errors compounded over time. He needed to go deeper than the digital record. He needed the basement. You want to play by the book, Linda? Elias muttered, grabbing his hat. Let's go find the author. The county records annex was a brutalist block of concrete on the edge of downtown, a building designed to survive a nuclear winter, or worse, a budget audit. To most people, it was a purgatory of waiting lines and fluorescent lights. To Elias, it was a sanctuary. He bypassed the main lobby where irritated citizens waited to renew vehicle tags. He took the stairs down, past the signs that said staff only, and pushed through a heavy steel door marked Archives and Deeds. Historical Division. The air changed instantly. The smell of floor cleaner was replaced by the distinct acidic scent of decaying paper and acetate. It was the smell of history decomposing. I wondered when you'd show up, a voice rasped from behind the counter. Marge was 70, sitting amidst stacks of bound volumes like a dragon guarding a hoard of boring treasure. She had been the custodian of the county's geography since the Reagan administration. They're trying to take the creek bank, Marge, Elias said, leaning his architectural tube against the counter. Based on the GIS overlay. Marge snorted, a sound like tearing parchment. GIS. Fancy cartoons for people who can't read a compass. They think because it's on a screen, it's holy writ. What do you need? The parent tract, Elias said. Section 14, Township 3. The original partition before the Oak Creek subdivision was platted in '98. I need to see the traverse closure from the 1975 survey. The physical map, Marge, not the scan. Marge nodded solemnly. She produced a ring of keys and unlocked the cage behind her. Row 4, bin C, don't make a mess. Elias walked into the stacks. The silence was heavy. He found the bin, a wide, flat drawer labeled 1970 to 1979, rural and agricultural. He pulled it open. He flipped through large sheets of linen and mylar until he found it. Plat Book 42, page 118. He carefully lifted the large sheet and carried it to the drafting table in the center of the room. He switched on the backlight. The map glowed, the black ink lines sharp and precise against the translucent material. This was drawn by hand. It was art. Elias unrolled the modern printout the HOA had given him, the one Linda waved around like a weapon. He laid it next to the 1975 original. He took out his scale ruler and his loop. He began to trace the meets and bounds. North 88 degrees, 14 minutes, 30 seconds west, he muttered, reading the call on the 1975 map. He measured the distance to the creek. Then he looked at the 1998 subdivision plat used by the HOA. North 88 degrees, 12 minutes west. 2 minutes. It sounded like nothing. On a protractor, it was invisible to the naked eye. But over a distance of 600 feet, a 2-minute error in bearing swung the tail end of the property line significantly. The developer's surveyor in 1998 had been lazy. When they carved up the old farm to build the subdivision, they hadn't reshot the back line. They had just copied the old deed but made a transcription error, rounding the minutes. Then they fitted the common area into the remaining space. Because of that typo, the digital map and the HOA's claim skewed the line 20 feet into Elias's yard. But in land law, the original monument's in the senior deed controlled. The mistake in the newer map didn't change the ownership. It just created a false picture. Elias traced the line further. He found what he was looking for. On the 1975 map, right at the corner of the creek, was a notation. Set one housed iron pin, cap number 4022. The pin, Ostian, the physical anchor of truth. If that pin was still in the ground, Linda's digital map was worthless. The error wasn't his. The error was theirs. And by acting on it, they were committing slander of title. Gotcha, Elias whispered. He felt a cold calm wash over him. This wasn't just a defense anymore. This was a trap. Marge, he called out, not looking up from the glowing table. I need certified copies, with the raised seal, all of them. Find a ghost? Marge asked, walking over. Better, Elias said, rolling up the 1975 map with reverence. I found a typo worth $100,000. He checked his watch. The excavators were coming at 8 a.m. tomorrow. That gave him 14 hours to prepare the ground. Not for a fight, but for a revelation. He paid the fee, took the heavy, sealed envelope, and walked out of the basement. The sun outside was blinding, but Elias saw everything with perfect clarity. He drove home, but he didn't go inside. He went to the garage and grabbed his metal detector and a shovel. He walked to the back corner of his lot, near the old oak tree, exactly where the 1975 map said the pin should be. He swept the coil over the thick grass. Beep. High-pitched, strong. Elias knelt. He dug carefully, peeling back the sod like surgery. 6 inches down, coated in 40 years of rust, but immovable as the earth itself, was the iron head of a survey pin. He didn't pull it out. He cleaned it off, leaving it exposed in its small, earthen grave. Let them bring the bulldozers. Elias spent the afternoon acting like a defeated man. It was a performance designed for an audience of one. He deliberately moved slowly, his shoulders slumped, as he dragged his heavy teak patio chairs away from the fence line. He unhooked the hanging planters from the trellis, piling them haphazardly on the safe side of his lawn. To anyone watching from the street, and he knew Linda was watching, it looked like capitulation. The old man was retreating, but inside the house, the atmosphere was surgical. Elias had pulled 3 boxes from his closet. They weren't surveying tools this time. They were surveillance. He mounted 2 4K wireless cameras under the eaves of his roof, angling them to cross-shoot the disputed boundary. They were small, matte black, and virtually invisible against the dark gutters. The most important piece of equipment, however, wasn't a camera. It was a high-gain shotgun microphone, the kind used for bird watching or private investigation. He concealed it inside a decorative birdhouse hanging from the oak tree, pointing it directly at the spot where the orange spray paint scarred the grass. He synced the feeds to a secure cloud server and a backup hard drive in his study. He tested the audio sensitivity. The microphone picked up the rustle of a squirrel moving through dry leaves 30 feet away. It would certainly pick up a conversation. By sunset, the stage was set. The construction zone was cleared of Elias's personal effects, leaving only the grass, the tree, and the invisible iron pin he had reburied under a loose layer of soil. At 6:30 p.m., as the twilight deepened into purple bruising across the sky, the silver Lexus pulled up. Elias was outside, sweeping the patio with unnecessary diligence. He didn't look up as the car door slammed. Linda Calloway walked up the driveway. She wasn't wearing her business suit. She was in casual evening wear, looking relaxed, victorious. She stopped at the edge of the lawn, surveying the cleared space. "Much better, Elias," she called out. Her voice was bright, carrying that specific tone of condescension reserved for children and the elderly. "I see you finally decided to be reasonable." Elias stopped sweeping. He leaned on the broom handle, looking tired. He glanced toward the birdhouse. The red recording light on his monitor inside was taped over, but the system was running. "I moved the chairs, Linda," Elias said, his voice low. "I don't want your excavators crushing my furniture." "It's not just about the furniture," Linda said, stepping onto the grass, walking right into the focal point of camera one. "It's about the community. You know, once the path is built, you'll appreciate the increase in your home's value. We're really doing you a favor." Elias took a step closer, ensuring the audio would be crystal clear. "I have a question, Linda. Before you dig tomorrow." "Make it quick, Elias. I have a dinner reservation." "Did anyone from the board actually check the physical monuments? The iron pins from 1975? Linda laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound. "We don't live in the dark ages, Elias. We have the digital overlay from the county GIS. It's accurate to the inch. We don't need to go digging around in the dirt for rusty spikes." "So you're proceeding based solely on the digital map?" Elias pressed, locking the statement in. "Even though I told you it conflicts with the deed?" "The digital map is the official record as far as the HOA is concerned," Linda stated, checking her watch. "The board approved the plan. The plan uses the map. That's the end of it. Don't cause a scene tomorrow, Elias. Officer Miller won't be as polite the second time." She turned and walked back to her car, her heels clicking on the pavement. Elias watched her go. He waited until the taillights disappeared around the curve. He went inside and sat at his desk. He rewound the footage. "We don't need to go digging around in the dark for rusty spikes." He saved the clip. Then he made a backup copy. Then he emailed the file to his attorney, a man named Saul who specialized in property litigation and hated HOAs with a burning passion. Linda thought she had just won an argument. In reality, she had just admitted to gross negligence on tape. She had confirmed that the HOA was knowingly proceeding without verifying the physical boundary markers, explicitly ignoring the homeowner's warning. In the eyes of the court, that moved the needle from accidental trespass to willful destruction of property. Elias went to the kitchen and made a sandwich. He ate it standing up, watching the live feed of his dark backyard. The excavators were coming at 8 a.m. He wouldn't be standing in front of them with a shotgun. That was what they expected. He would be standing there with something far more dangerous. He picked up his phone and dialed the non-emergency line for the sheriff's department. "Dispatch? This is Elias Thorne. I'd like to request a deputy presence at my property tomorrow morning at 07:45. "Yes, I believe there's going to be a significant breach of the peace. No, not by me, by the people bringing the bulldozers." He hung up and turned off the kitchen light. The house went dark, but the cameras kept watching, unblinking eyes in the night. The sound of a diesel engine is different from a car. It is a deep, chest-rattling thrum that speaks of torque and destruction. At 7:50 a.m., a flatbed truck backed into the cul-de-sac. On its bed sat a compact excavator, its yellow paint scarred from use, its hydraulic arm folded like a sleeping mantis. Elias stood on his back porch. He was wearing his boots and a heavy canvas jacket. In his hand, he held a thick envelope fresh from his printer. He watched as the Greenscale crew unloaded the machine. The metal tracks clattered against the pavement, sparking slightly before biting into the asphalt. The operator, a man with heavy earmuffs and a bored expression, throttled the engine up. A plume of black smoke rose into the clear morning air. Linda Calloway was standing near the curb, her arms crossed, watching the machine with a look of intense satisfaction. She wasn't just building a path, she was erasing an obstacle. The excavator rolled over the curb and onto the grass of the easement. The tracks chewed up the turf, leaving deep, muddy scars. It moved toward Elias's fence, the bucket raising slowly, positioning itself to hook the corner post and rip it from the earth. Elias walked out. He didn't run. He moved with the terrifying calmness of a man who has already checked the math. He walked past the orange spray paint. He walked past the construction zone signs Linda had planted. He stopped directly in front of the excavator, 5 feet from the steel bucket. The operator honked the horn, a sharp, deafening blast. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't move. "Get out of the way, Elias," Linda shouted over the engine noise, hurrying over. "You are obstructing a contracted vehicle. I will have you arrested." "Turn it off," Elias said. He wasn't looking at Linda. He was looking at the operator. "I said move," Linda screamed. She pulled out her phone. "Officer Miller, he's doing it again." Deputy Miller, who had been sitting in his patrol car parked discreetly down the street, stepped out. He adjusted his belt and walked onto the lawn. He looked weary, like a man who hated domestic disputes. "Mr. Thorne," Miller shouted over the diesel roar. You need to step away from the machinery. We talked about this. I'm not obstructing maintenance, Elias said, his voice steady. I am preventing a felony. He held up the envelope. This is a temporary restraining order signed by Judge Harlan at 7:15 this morning, based on evidence of willful trespass and slander of title. Linda snatched at the paper, but Miller intercepted it. The deputy waved his hand at the operator, making a cut-it motion across his throat. The operator hesitated, then killed the engine. The silence that rushed back into the yard was heavy and ringing. Miller read the document. His eyebrows went up. This is an emergency stay, Miller said, looking at Linda. It prohibits any alteration of the disputed boundary until a formal survey is conducted by an independent third party. That's ridiculous, Linda spat. We have a survey. The digital plat is filed with the city. He's just stalling. No, Elias said. I'm not stalling. I'm correcting. Elias turned and walked to the spot near the oak tree where he had dug the night before. He kicked the loose soil away with his boot. Officer, look here. Miller walked over, peering down into the small hole. Linda followed, her face flushed with anger. At the bottom of the hole, cap number 402 was clearly visible on the rusty iron head, stamped with the year 1975. That, Elias pointed, is the original section corner, the monument of record. Under state law, this physical pin supersedes any digital map or paper drawing. He pulled a tape measure from his pocket. He hooked the end onto the pin and walked it back toward the excavator. He stopped right at the machine's tracks. 15 feet, Elias said. The machine is sitting on my land, not the easement, my land. He looked at Linda. You didn't check the pins, Linda. You admitted it last night. And now you've driven heavy machinery onto private property to destroy a structure you don't own. That is malicious destruction of property. Linda looked at the pin, then at the map on her tablet, then back at the pin. Her confidence flickered just for a second before her arrogance walled it off. You could have put that there yourself. It's rusted into the earth and encased in 40-year-old clay, Miller said, his voice hardening. He looked at Linda. Ms. Calloway, this is a civil matter now, but this order is valid. No one touches that fence today. Miller turned to the operator. Load it up. You're done here. But we have a contract, Linda protested, her voice shrill. Take it up with the judge, Miller said. If that bucket touches that wood, I'm arresting the operator for vandalism, and I'm arresting you for solicitation of a crime. The operator didn't wait for Linda's permission. He restarted the engine, threw the machine into reverse, and backed away from the fence. Elias watched them go. He watched the flatbed sustain the weight of the retreating machine. He watched Linda storm off to her Lexus, phone pressed to her ear, undoubtedly screaming at the HOA's lawyer. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He simply took the tape measure, retracted the blade with a sharp snap, and walked back to his porch. The fence stood, but Elias knew the real demolition was yet to come. It wouldn't happen on the lawn. It would happen in the assembly hall. The Oak Creek Community Center was standing room only. Bad news travels faster than good, and the rumor of a lawsuit had drawn neighbors out of their homes like moths to a burning porch light. Linda Calloway stood at the podium, flanked by the board. She looked exhausted but defiant. She had spent the last week spinning the narrative, painting Elias as a senile obstructionist who was single-handedly draining the reserve fund. We are currently facing an unexpected budget shortfall, Linda announced, her voice grave. Due to the aggressive litigation initiated by Mr. Thorne regarding the creek path, we have been forced to retain external counsel. This may result in a special assessment fee of $500 per household next quarter. A groan went through the room. Angry whispers broke out. Heads turned to look at Elias, who was sitting in the front row, a large rolled document resting across his knees. However, Linda continued, raising her voice to regain control, we are confident the court will rule in our favor. The digital records are clear. We will not let one resident hold our community hostage. She looked down at Elias. Mr. Thorne, since you insisted on being added to the agenda, you have 5 minutes. Please try to keep it civil. Elias stood up. He didn't walk to the microphone immediately. He walked to the side of the room and set up a portable easel he had brought with him. He placed a large foam core board on it, covered by a blank sheet of paper. Then he took the microphone. I'm not here to talk about my fence, Elias said. His voice was calm, the voice of a man explaining gravity to someone holding a rock. I'm here to talk about math. Mr. Thorne, if this is not relevant to the agenda, Greg the treasurer started. It is the agenda, Elias interrupted. You wanted to build a path on what you think is common ground. You think the property line is in my backyard. Linda relies on the 1998 subdivision map. I rely on the 1975 parent tract deed. Elias walked to the easel and pulled the cover sheet off. It was a large, high-resolution print. It showed the entire subdivision, overlaid with two sets of lines. One set was blue, the HOA's map, and one set was red, Elias's survey based on the recovered iron pins. The blue line is where you think the boundary is, Elias said, pointing to the laser straight line cutting through his garden. The red line is where the iron pins say it is. The difference is a bearing error of 2 minutes. Over short distances, you don't notice it, but geometry is unforgiving. As you move west, that error grows. He traced the red line away from his house, moving across the map, past the creek, and toward the center of the community grounds. The error starts at my oak tree, Elias explained, but it continues for 800 feet along the vector. It creates a wedge. By the time you get to the common area B, Elias tapped a specific spot on the map. The room went deadly silent. The red line, the legal property line confirmed by the iron pin, didn't stop at the grass. It cut directly through the middle of the community swimming pool. It sliced through the pool deck, the pump house, and the entire outdoor patio of the clubhouse. You built the pool in 2005, Elias said, looking directly at the board. You didn't survey the parent tract then either. You just used the same flawed digital overlay, according to the deed I hold and the pins I unearthed. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle on the room. The deep end of the community pool, the pump house, and the gazebo are not on HOA land. They are on my land. Linda's face went white. That's impossible. We own that lot. You own the lot next to it, Elias corrected. But because your map is rotated 2 degrees west, you poured concrete on my property. That's a permanent encroachment. The murmurs in the room exploded into shouting. People weren't looking at Elias with anger anymore. They were looking at the board with panic. If the pool was on private property, the HOA didn't just have a lawsuit on their hands. They had an existential crisis. I have the demolition order drafted, Elias said, his voice cutting through the noise. If you can order me to remove a wooden fence because it's unsightly, imagine what a judge will say about 100 tons of unauthorized concrete on a retired surveyor's land. He looked at Linda. She had slumped back in her chair, the gavel limp in her hand. You wanted to enforce the strict letter of the law, Linda, Elias said, folding his arms. You wanted to talk about boundaries. Well, you're sitting on the wrong side of one. What do you want? Greg asked, his voice trembling. Do you want money? I want my fence left alone, Elias said, and I want to talk about a settlement, but not with Linda. She's done. Elias walked back to his seat and sat down. He didn't need to say anything else. The geometry had done the talking for him. The conference room at the law firm of Sterling and Associates was on the top floor, offering a panoramic view of the city. It was designed to intimidate, but Elias Thorne sat in the high-backed leather chair, looking entirely unimpressed. Next to him, his attorney Saul was casually organizing a stack of files that contained enough leverage to bankrupt the Oak Creek Homeowners Association 3 times over. Across the table sat Greg, the treasurer, and 2 other board members. They looked pale. Linda Calloway was not present. She had been advised by their counsel to stay home. Let's look at the reality of the situation, Saul began, his voice pleasant but sharp. My client has a valid claim to ejectment. You have built a commercial-grade swimming pool, a pump house, and a concrete patio on his fee simple property. Under the law, he has every right to demand you remove the encroachment. I've consulted with a demolition contractor. The cost to remove the pool and rehabilitate the land to its original state is estimated at $250,000. Greg wiped sweat from his forehead. We don't have that kind of money in the reserves. A special assessment that high, the residents would revolt. They'd recall the board. They certainly would, Saul agreed. And that's before we discuss the punitive damages for the harassment, the trespassing, and the attempted destruction of Mr. Thorne's grandfathered fence. The HOA's lawyer, Mr. Sterling, leaned forward. He was a pragmatist. What does Mr. Thorne want? I assume he doesn't actually want to own a community pool. Elias spoke for the first time. I don't swim. He placed his hands on the mahogany table. I didn't start this war. I just wanted to keep my fence and my quiet mornings. Your president decided that wasn't enough. We are prepared to wipe the fines, Mr. Sterling offered quickly, all $1,050, and we will issue a formal apology. The fines are illegal, so wiping them is a given, Saul countered. Here's the proposal. Saul slid a thin document across the table. Mr. Thorne is willing to grant a perpetual easement for the encroached area. This allows the pool to remain. He retains ownership of the land, but the HOA gets the right to use it. No demolition, no bankruptcy. Greg exhaled, a sound of pure relief. That's very generous. There are conditions, Saul said, holding up a finger. First, the HOA pays all of Mr. Thorne's legal fees, totaling $12,000. Second, a payment of damages for the trespass and distress set at $15,000. Third, the bylaws are amended to require a certified physical survey before any future violation notice is issued to a resident. Done, Greg said immediately. We can manage that. And the fourth condition, Elias said, his voice dropping lower. Linda Calloway resigns, today, irrevocably, and she is barred from holding a board seat for 10 years. The room went quiet. Linda had handpicked these board members. She was their leader. But she was also the reason they were staring down the barrel of a lawsuit. Mr. Sterling looked at his clients. He didn't say a word, but his eyes said everything. Cut the limb to save the body. Greg looked down at his hands, then nodded slowly. She served us with a liability nightmare. I'll ask for her resignation letter by noon. Don't ask, Elias said, standing up. Tell her, just like she told me about the bulldozers. 3 weeks later, the morning air was crisp, signaling the deep settling of autumn. The leaves of the ancient oak tree had turned a brilliant, burning red. Elias sat on his back porch. The teak furniture was back in its place. The hanging planters were rehung on the trellis. The fence, weathered, split rail, and imperfect, stood exactly where it had for 20 years. There was no orange paint on the grass. The rain had washed it away, and the grass had grown over the scars left by the excavator's tracks. He picked up the local community newsletter from the table. The front page featured a smiling picture of Greg, the acting president, announcing a new era of cooperation and transparency. Buried on page 4 in a small text box was a brief note thanking Linda Calloway for her past service. Elias folded the paper and set it aside. He picked up his coffee and looked out toward the creek. He could hear the faint sound of children playing at the pool in the distance. They were swimming on his land, splashing in water that sat on dirt he paid taxes on. He didn't mind. The lines were drawn. The truth was known. The deed was back in the fireproof safe, and the iron pin was safely asleep under the earth, guarding the corner. He took a sip of coffee. It tasted better than it had in months. The geometry of the neighborhood was restored. And finally, so was the silence.